So why do so many Europeans look at the United States and think its gun laws are completely bonkers? Not because Europe is uniformly anti-gun, not because Europeans are genetically obedient little statists, and not because Americans are uniquely irrational. It's because the two sides are starting from radically different historical memories. Under my World War II videos, I often see the comment that if only the Germans had guns, they would have overthrown the Nazis. Now, that comment is mostly by American viewers, and while it is based on a false presumption, as we shall see, there is a historical reason for the opinion and why it seems false to many Europeans. In the American story, the armed citizen is tied to liberty, resistance, independence, and distrust of concentrated power. In the European story, armed politics is just as likely to mean civil breakdown, militias in the street, party violence, ethnic killing, and democracy collapsing under pressure. So when Europeans hear Americans say an armed populace protects freedom, a lot of them do not hear the Wild West. They hear Weimar. They hear the Balkans. They hear the 20th century saying yes, and sometimes armed men destroy republics faster than anyone can save them. Now, my take on this is not coming from some squeamish anti-gun position. I'm not anti-gun. Back when I lived in Sweden, I'd go to the range quite regularly. I understand the appeal. Guns are technically interesting, historically important, and in the right setting, perfectly legitimate tools. I'm also a military historian, which means I spend a lot of time talking about how societies organize violence, who gets to use it, and what happens when that organization breaks down. And that is exactly why I think a lot of Americans miss what many Europeans are reacting to. And let's be clear, it's not that Europeans in general are concerned about the hobby use of guns, like enjoying sport shooting or hunting or collecting old rifles. It's about what kind of society you build when lethal force is treated not as an exceptional responsibility, but as a default expression of citizenship. And to many Europeans, that looks nuts. Now, let's also be clear that not all European states have totally restrictive gun laws. Finland has hundreds of thousands of license holders and describes itself officially as a country of hunters and gun enthusiasts. Sweden licenses firearms for hunting and target shooting. Switzerland has legal civilian access too, and so on. But as a default, buying many weapons still runs through contracts or acquisition permits, and carrying a weapon in public requires a permit and proof of need. Small arms survey data also place Finland, Switzerland, and Sweden among Europe's higher civilian gun-owning societies. So why do many Europeans still find American gun laws bonkers? Because the core European memory is not armed citizens make freedom. It's when politics gets armed, very bad things tend to happen. A large part of the difference lies in the American origin of the laws governing gun ownership and begin with the Second Amendment in its original world. In the newborn republic, standing armies were feared, centralized power was feared, and the new federal government's control over militia was feared. Congress's own constitutional history notes that early drafts and proposals framed the militia as composed of the body of the people, and founding-era debates assumed that an armed citizenry was connected to the security of a free state and to resistance against potential federal overreach. That is a very particular political narrative. The armed citizen is not just a private homeowner with a weapon. He is imagined as part of the body politic itself, a citizen soldier, a reserve against tyranny, an alternative to permanent coercive apparatus. This differs very much to the European perspective of the time and is part of the very base that the Founding Fathers aimed to construct to not create the feudal structures of their once homelands. Because in much of old regime Europe, bearing arms was historically not cast as a universal democratic right. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 allowed Protestants to have arms for defense, but only suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law, which is a very qualified, status-conscious, religious confessional formulation. Moreover, the legal framework of the English gun settlement was more concerned with Parliament's rights and privileges than with broad individual rights. In Ancien Régime France, noblemen alone possessed the honorific right to carry a sword, and the nobility had exclusive privileges to hunt and bear arms in public. So, at least in theory, the American move is genuinely radical. Arms are linked not to aristocratic estate, but to the people. Now, in practice, this was never fully egalitarian. Early American gun laws and militia practices excluded many people, especially enslaved black people and often free black people. To not mention that guns played a huge part in the conquest of the West and hence the demise of the pre-Columbian cultures and peoples of the continent. Nevertheless, the language and self-image were still far more democratic than the explicitly status-bound model many Europeans inherited. Thus, by legal and cultural heritage, right or wrong, Americans tend to see gun rights as democratized power, while Europeans see it as an old privilege transformed into a modern myth. That it is viewed as mythological has a lot to do with what happens in Europe after the American Revolution. Because European political memory is full of moments when armed civilians, militias, and paramilitary groups did not stand fast, guns in hand, to protect liberty, but rose up to shoot freedom, security, and decency to pieces. The situation in post-Great War Europe stands out, when wartime violence spilled into the peace and post-war paramilitaries often directed extraordinary violence at civilians. In Germany especially, the Weimar Republic was marked by political turmoil and political violence that nationally exasperated the global hardships of the boom and bust 1920s and set the stage for the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. In fact, the Nazi citizen militia, the SA, was integral to Hitler's rise. It grew out of the many private militias of various political color, the Freikorps, after World War I, and violently enforced Nazi norms and helped influence elections. In other words, in one of Europe's most important historical memories, armed party formations are not the last defense of democracy, they are part of how democracy dies. And that lesson is not limited to Germany. Across Europe, the 19th and 20th centuries are littered with revolutions, civil wars, occupations, coups, and party militias. So when Americans invoke the romantic figure of the armed citizen, many Europeans instinctively ask, yes, but armed for what? Under whose authority? And what happens when rival factions all decide they are the people? Then add mass shootings. Europe has had them too. Dunblane in Britain became a national trauma, and the British government's response accepted multiple tighter controls. Research on gun violence in Europe also notes that school mass shootings in countries like France and Germany repeatedly sparked public outcry and legislative measures, helping explain why such incidents remained rare. Finnish authorities and researchers alike tie tighter handgun control to the aftermath of the school shootings of the 2000s. Hence, the European reflex is shaped by repeated bad experiences. When lethal force escapes tight social and legal control, it doesn't usually produce Republican virtue. It produces fear and death. Now, you'll sometimes hear the argument that we've talked about that civilian gun ownership is the ultimate safeguard for freedom because if tyranny comes, the people can fight back. And the harsh European rejoinder is, really? If access to weapons was easier in the 1930s than it is in much of Europe today, why didn't that save democracy? Why didn't the Jews simply shoot their way out of Nazism? By liberal gun activists from America, it is sometimes erroneously attributed to that the Nazis took away people's guns. The historical answer is that the Nazis did not take away people's guns, and more importantly, the European Jews did not fail to resist. They did resist. Jewish civilians offered armed resistance in more than 100 ghettos in occupied Poland and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was the largest and symbolically most important Jewish uprising of the war. But these many examples of armed resistance also highlight the overwhelming obstacles. Not enough weapons and training, hostile surroundings, isolation, terror, starvation, the threat of collective reprisals, and the enormous asymmetry between scattered civilians and a modern genocidal state. Armed resistance existed. What did not exist was anything like equal power. And that is the crucial point. A society containing guns is not the same thing as a society capable of organized democratic self-defense. Democracy is not saved by the abstract existence of private weapons, once a dictatorship already controls the police, the army, transport, communications, prisons, and food. By that stage, the decisive question is not who owns a pistol, it is who controls the state. From a European perspective, then, guns protect democracy sounds less like sober history than like a comforting myth. Courage matters, resistance matters, but private armament on its own does not reliably stop tyranny. And that brings us to the real philosophical divide. individual rights versus collective safety. Much of European political development moved towards the idea that modern democratic states should monopolize legitimate force. The state alone then claims the legitimate use of physical force within a territory. Like the American reaction to the old system of power in Europe, this is a departure from that system. Under feudalism, no lord, not even the king, fully possessed that monopoly, which led to petty armed conflicts and civil war again and again. In plain English, modern politics works by taking violence out of private hands and putting it under public, legal, accountable control. Now, that does not mean Europeans think the state is always good. Europe has more than enough history of abusive states. But many Europeans still conclude that liberty is safer when coercion is centralized, regulated, and constrained by institutions than when every citizen imagines himself a miniature sovereign. And that is why a lot of Europeans can accept licensed civilian ownership for hunting, sport shooting, collecting, or militia-related traditions, while still rejecting a broad legal culture of easy carrying and maximal private entitlement. In the European framework, guns may be allowed, sometimes quite widely, but they sit inside a system of permissions, reasons, vetting, and restrictions. That looks normal in Europe because the social goal is not symbolic empowerment, it is keeping politics non-lethal. So when many Europeans say American gun laws are bonkers, they usually do not mean nobody should ever own a gun. Switzerland, Finland, and Sweden alone should cure you of that simplification. What they mean is this: the American legal imagination still treats private weapon ownership as a foundational safeguard of freedom, while the European historical imagination more often treats widespread access to weapons as something that becomes dangerous precisely when politics is under stress. Americans remember the citizen militia fighting for independence. Europeans remember the militia becoming the SA to subjugate their own nation to their will. Americans remember resistance to distant powers, the right to individual empowerment, and argue that shooting incidents are an acceptable price for that. Europeans remember civil conflict, paramilitary intimidation, occupation, and school funerals, and argue that some restrictions on individual freedoms are required to keep society safer for everyone. Different historical memories produce different instincts. And that, more than any stereotype about European softness or American craziness, is why so many Europeans look at U.S. gun laws and think, this is not freedom in a healthy republic. This is a society keeping one foot in the grave dug by a very old and very risky political mythology.